Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever in the world you are. I would like to address one important election issue in Zimbabwe today. Should the opposition boycott the elections? This has been a thorny issue. It's been raised again and again and again. The number one point that one has got to address is it viable to boycott elections? Well, the truth of the matter is elections are a process governed by rules. One of the basic requirements for participating in the elections is that the elections must be free, fair, and credible. So, without going into detail, if those conditions are met, surely one has got to say there must be repercussions. And to say that you will never boycott elections, regardless of how undemocratic the process becomes ridiculous. If I am the one who is responsible for making sure elections are free, fair, and credible, and it is to my advantage to rig elections, and I know you'll participate regardless of how flawed the process becomes, what is the motivation for me to make sure that elections are free, fair, and credible? We've discussed this issue with many people. Well, they will accept the ZANU-PF will never reform itself out of power. The same people would say, oh, we've got to participate regardless of how flawed the process becomes. So it is in ZANU-PF's interest to rig elections. And if they know that you'll participate regardless how flawed the process becomes, then surely they will never, ever implement any meaningful reform, because they know if they implement reforms, they will lose the election. And they know if they don't implement the reforms, you will participate and give the process legitimacy. So I think that point has got to be settled. There is no such thing as we can never, you must always participate in elections. There must be red lines, which you can say, if you cross these red lines, it is absolutely, utterly pointless for me to participate in these elections. And in my view, these 2023 elections, like so many other elections in the past, ZANU-PF has crossed those red lines. One of the ways is the failure to produce a verified voters roll. What is the point of participating in an election process in which you do not know who is going to vote? When you try to register your own supporters, they make it very difficult for them to register. It is common knowledge that the opposition has had as part of its winning strategy to register as many people as possible. And they had set themselves a target of registering 6 million. But as of 30th of May last year, 4 years since the last election, only 250,000 people had registered to vote. And during that period, one heard of reports of only 2 offices available for voters to register in towns like Harare, with 2 million people. Anyone who has participated in Zimbabwean election would tell you Kuti, the ZEC has made it very, very difficult for the opposition to register their supporters. And in typical ZANU-PF tradition, the party has always registered its own supporters a few months before the election. Last week, we saw videos of ZANU-PF supporters passed in from rural areas, Roboshava, Koromonzi, coming into Harare to register. Not because they couldn't register in their own rural homes, they've registered in their own rural homes. But they're coming to Harare to register again. Because come the day of voting, they will vote in their rural home, then they'll be passed in to vote in the urban centers as well. That's boosting ZANU-PF votes. The reason why they are registering this last minute is that way they are assured they will not be in the voters' roll. So even if one was to somehow come across a voters' roll, those names will not be in, and then these people will still vote. And those who are in the voters' roll, ZEC has stubbornly refused to release a verified voters' roll. ZANU-PF is rigging these elections. That is a fact. That is a red line that the regime has already crossed. Another one is the refusal to grant the 3 million Zimbabweans in the diaspora the vote. 3 million. Mnangagwa won 2018 elections with 2.4 million. How can you deny 3 million voters the right to vote under the pretext that the regime the West has imposed sanctions on the regime and so it cannot travel? That's nonsense. So the point I've made is there are red lines. We can discuss on which are the red lines, but there have got to be red lines in any election. This is a process that is governed by rules. So one has got to agree there is a point when you can say you have broken the rules to the point where these elections are totally meaningless. So to say it is outright rejection of boycotting election as an option is a nonsense. Why would you rule the possibility of boycotting elections if the process is so flawed that it becomes meaningless? And these elections are already flawed. The only viable option is to boycott them. The reason why the opposition will never boycott the elections, now that is what we've got to understand. Triple C, MDC before it would never boycott elections because during the GNU, when they had the opportunity to implement the reforms, the very reforms that stopped ZANU-PF rigging the elections, they failed to implement even one. So for them to have boycotted the 2013 election, which was their best one, to do so was not viable, because you don't boycott elections and then turn around it's because we want reforms to be implemented. And then you ask, why didn't you implement the reforms? And you can't answer it. And the reason why they didn't implement reforms, of course, is because they had been bribed by ZANU-PF to forget about the reforms. And that is why they keep on participating. If you do not believe me that MDC failed to implement reforms and they are participating out of greed, please read this for yourself. This is a quotation from the book by David Coulthard. David Coulthard is one of the MDC, at the present moment, he is the MDC Secretary General, or Triple C rather, Secretary General. He was in the GNU during the 20 years of, sorry, the 5 years of the government of national unity. And in it, he is the one who is telling us here why the election in 2013 were so flawed that the only rational thing to have done was to boycott the elections. Here's the quotation. This is the book, and you can get it for yourself. It's available, I suppose, on Amazon or some other booksellers. This is a quotation from the book. He is writing about the 2013 election. The worst aspect for me about the failure to agree a coalition was that both MDCs couldn't now do the obvious, withdraw from the election. The election process was so flawed, so illegal, that the only logical step was to withdraw, which would have compelled SADC to hold ZANU-PF to account. But such was the distrust between the MDC-T and MDC-N that neither could withdraw for fear that the other would remain in the election, winning the seats and giving the process credibility. So in other words, they've been participating in these elections purely and simply out of greed. And it is absurd that the people of Zimbabwe should find themselves stuck with a regime that is being kept in power by the greed of a few individuals. If you ask most people now why the opposition should not boycott the election, one of the reasons they will tell you is, oh, we can't boycott the election because that will only allow some of the opposition created by ZANU-PF to participate. That is a most feeble excuse you can give. So you are now perpetuating the ZANU-PF dictatorship because you do not want the likes of Monsora or Lafmo Maduku to remain in as the opposition and win the few seats that are available. In the last election, 2018, Nelson Chamisa won, according to ZEC, about 42%. And the rest of all the other 23 opposition parties that participated in those elections won between them 4% of the vote, with Mnangagwa getting the majority, the 50.8%, to win the presidency. So you want to tell me that if MDC Alliance then boycotted the election and the 42% of the electorate had not participated, the world would not have noticed? Of course they would have noticed. Even if the other opposition factions do participate, that is not your responsibility as an individual. Your responsibility is to say, I'm not going to participate in these elections if all I'm doing is give ZANU-PF legitimacy. Even if it means I'm losing out on the bait seats that are available. That is your responsibility. That is your rational decision to make. To give the excuse that we have got to participate because otherwise the other side will participate and win the few seats that are being used to bribe the opposition to participate is a totally irrational argument. We have reached the point now where ZANU-PF is determined and is rigging these 2023 elections. There cannot be any debate about that. The only rational thing to do is not to participate. The only reason why the opposition is participating is purely out of greed. And I think this is now the time when the nation has got to stand up and hold these people to account. We cannot keep on perpetuating this ZANU-PF dictatorship just to gratify the insatiable greed of the few in the opposition. That is totally unacceptable. Zimbabwe cannot afford another 5 more years of this corrupt and incompetent and tyrannical ZANU-PF regime because someone in the opposition is too greedy to accept that the only way we are going to stop ZANU-PF rigging the election is saying to them, those rules for free, fair, and credible elections are there for a reason. If you are not going to uphold them, then you can have your own election on your own. And it is ridiculous to suggest that the international community will accept ZANU-PF holding the elections, and even if the likes of Monzora and Maduku participate and will grant them legitimacy, they will not. That has never happened in the past. The reason why we had the 2008 election GNU is because SADC would not accept ZANU-PF as blatant violence in those elections. Before independence, Ian Smith tried the same trick when he held his internal settlement, and Musorewa and Dawaning Stole participated, and they failed to get international recognition because the world realized that those internal settlements were just Musorewa and Dawaning Stole selling out. We need to accept boycotting these flawed elections is the only viable, rational thing to do. And we must reject all the feeble excuses for participating in these elections just to cover for their greed. Triple C, Nelson Chamisa, does not have any of the so-called winning in rigged election strategies. He doesn't. His flagship strategy of mass voter registration is dead in the water. He only managed to register 250,000 as of 30th of May last year. Right now, it is ZANU-PF who are registering their own supporters. Some of them, even in the dead of the night. There have been videos of showing ZANU-PF supporters registering with the offices still open at 11 o'clock in the evening to register them. And those people are registering not because they haven't registered already. They are registering several times. This will enable them to vote several times to boost the vote counts of ZANU-PF. The process is so flawed. There is really no excuse for keeping on participating. That message must be sent and must be said loudly and clearly. And those who participate must know they are doing so out of greed. Thank you and good night.